Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's November 8th, 2025. We are going to be going through the exit polls from the shellacking that the Democratic Party delivered to Republicans in this off-year election. It was a clean sweep, and the GOP got obliterated everywhere. It was another victory for the often maligned polling industry. The polls got this right. They got everything about the race right, even the things that seemed like they might be a consequence of corporate media institutional bias, trying to seed the ground for a Democratic victory, in particular in the Attorney General's race in Virginia, where the AG-elect had come under scrutiny for saying that he wanted Republican leaders' children to die in their arms to teach them a lesson or something to that effect. And he said that publicly, and he said that to members of the other party, and he really offered no apology for it, and there was no disavowal on the Democratic side of it. And so it was effectively a sort of Bolshevik calling for the murder of one's political enemies, 1918 style, with children being butchered in front of their parents before the parents too were butchered. Those were the premeditated words of who is going to, in 2 months, be the highest lawyer in the state of Virginia. Jones, the winner, won by 6 points, and this was one where if there is any criticism to be directed at the polling industry, this is it, because the RCP average leading up to this election had Jones, the Democrat, winning by less than a point, and he ended up winning by 6. So this one was actually outside the margin of error, marginally so, in the favor of Democrats. But the most salient election of last Tuesday was the New York City mayoral election, and the results of that contest underscore the point made here a couple weeks ago about how the great replacement has come now for Cuomo. As we go through these results, we'll see a dynamic, a pattern that is quite familiar all over the country. The biggest difference, of course, being that in the case of the New York City mayoral election, it was between a self-described Democratic socialist and a scion of the Democratic Party establishment. But it's not just the political and cultural dispossession of heritage America in flyover country that is the story of the 21st century, which has been deemed the century of identity in contrast to the century of ideology that characterized the 20th century. By race and sex, Cuomo won exactly one group. He won white men, 50% to 41%, and only narrowly lost among white women, with Cuomo getting 45% to Mamdani's 47%. In the case then of white men, Cuomo won by 9 points and lost among white women by 2 points. So if it were only whites voting, then Cuomo would have won by a few points. But of course, New York City, which was a century ago 97% white, is today barely 30% white. And so consequently, though Cuomo won among whites, and in total among all whites, Cuomo won 47 to Mamdani's 45%, so a couple point margin there. But even though Cuomo won among whites, Mamdani dominated among non-whites and consequently won the election by a double-digit margin. White Americans, this isn't going to be your country for much longer, if it still can be described as that at all, and white New York City denizens, the city has long since ceased to be yours. There was also a very stark generational divide at play. Among those aged 18 to 24, Mamdani got 76%. Among those 25 to 29, 75%. Among those in their 30s, 68%. Among those in their 40s, 48%. Among those between the ages of 50 and 64, Mamdani lost, getting only 41%, and among boomers, those 65 and older, Mamdani only got 34%. So we see a perfectly maintained inverse correlation between age and support for Mamdani. Young, non-white, and also credentialed. That is the picture we are painting here of the archetypal Mamdani voter. By educational attainment, among those with no high school degree or just a high school diploma but nothing beyond that, or with some amount of college but not even an associate's degree, in all three of those categories, so among the least educated, Cuomo won. He beat Mamdani comfortably in all three of those categories. Among those with just an associate's degree, so a 2-year degree, Mamdani and Cuomo split evenly. But among those with a bachelor's degree and also among those with an advanced degree, so postgraduate degree, Mamdani won handily by 20 points. Well, that's weird, because the story has been that this election has been all about affordability, and Mamdani hammering that over and over again, the difficulty in making ends meet for the working class in New York City. Why then is it that the most educated are those most likely to support Mamdani, while those with little to no formal education strongly went for Cuomo? The answer, I think, provides a lot of insight into the cultural dynamics that we will see playing out in the coming years and decades, and that is not necessarily a total decoupling of educational attainment from earning potential, but more specifically the consequences of a gross overproduction of educationally credentialed Americans who have no useful skills in the marketplace. Charles Murray has famously asserted that about 10% of the American adult population benefit from a liberal arts education, but college enrollment, although it has started to modestly drop in the last couple of years, still hovers around the 50% mark. And so if Murray's assertion is broadly correct, then about 4 out of every 5 people in college today shouldn't be there. College doesn't make people smarter. It uses college entrance exams to identify intelligent people and then have them come to the colleges and spend 4, 6, or 8 years in a very expensive, inefficient way to accumulate a bunch of debt to receive a piece of paper that more or less tells prospective employers what that entrance exam that got them into college, or that they took prior to entering college in the first place, would have told them 4 or 6 or 8 years ago. If college entrance exams like the ACT and the SAT were taken not just when first applying to college, but also upon graduation, the jig would be up, because people would realize that ACT scores and SAT scores didn't improve at all during those 4 or 6 or 8 years. And just as often as they marginally got better, they would marginally get worse. But overwhelmingly, for the vast majority of students who took the tests after they graduated, the results would be indistinguishable from the results prior to them entering, because the standardized tests are largely proxies for intelligence, and college doesn't make people smarter. But what so-called higher education does do in the West is saddle young adults with tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, in addition to saddling them with a sense of entitlement that because they spent 4 or 6 or 8 years in a dorm room or an apartment off campus, maybe devoting 15, 20 hours a week to academic pursuits and the rest to degenerate and hedonistic pursuits, that because they've gone through that while their compatriots who graduated and went to vocational schools or went out into the workforce were actually acquiring useful skills and experience, that they, the college graduates, should be entitled to higher paying, more prestigious jobs that demand less of them, as if they're some sort of effective minor nobility on account of pursuing higher education. And maybe when it's the top 10% of the population by conscientiousness and intelligence that is pursuing higher education just on account of them representing the cream of the crop, that often is how things played out. historically, centuries ago. But today, when it's more than half of the adult population going to secondary education, that is no longer the case. And the majority of those who languish in college for several years before graduating without having attained any useful or marketable skills, they find after years of serving as baristas at Starbucks that their sense of entitlement is rapidly replaced by a sense of grievance. And that serves as a segue to bring us back to the topic at hand, the exit polls from the New York City mayoral election. By income, we see that Mamdani won among those making less than $50,000 a year. He won among those making between $50,000 and $100,000 a year. And he even won modestly among those making between $100,000 and $200,000 a year. But he lost by 15 points, 40% for Mamdani to 55% for Cuomo among those making $200,000 or more. So even though the most educated tended to support Mamdani, those who made the most money tended to support Cuomo. And so if we fill in our archetypal Mamdani voter a little bit more, we get a brown-skinned, green-haired barista working at Starbucks who has accumulated $300,000 of student loan debt for her doctoral degree in gender studies, who is raging against fascism and colonialism and the patriarchy because she is unlikely to have kids as we move to the next exit polling data point. Among those who have children, Cuomo wins, with Mamdani only getting 45% of that slice of the electorate, although in New York City that only constitutes 23% of the voting population. Cities have been, since the dawn of time, a population sinkhole, with rural areas being more fecund. The bucolic countryside maintains a fertility rate above replacement, while those who leave the country to head towards the city tend to exhibit fertility below replacement. One of the stories concurrent with the global fall in fertility is the global rise in conurbation, as more and more people across the world, as a higher percentage of all people live in cities. Correspondingly, the global fertility rate tends to decline, and New York City, being the biggest metropolitan area by population in the United States, New York City is the citiest of cities, and the fertility patterns in New York City reflect that, with fewer than 1 in 4 voters having children. Among the 77% of the electorate without children, Mamdani won comfortably, 53% to Cuomo's 40%. As an aside, the astute listener will notice that there's been no mention of Sliwa here. He garnered just 7% of the overall vote, and even among Republicans got walloped. Among the 15% of the electorate who were Republican, just 21% voted for Sliwa compared to 75% of those who voted for Cuomo. And I think that is a dynamic that is worth paying attention to, because I suspect it will be the one that will come to characterize electoral patterns in the mid and later part of the 21st century in the United States, as the Republican Party fades into political insignificance. It will be replaced by a corporate wing of the Democratic Party, a neoliberal merged with neoconservative establishment, again, corporate, institutional, center-left party that will compete with a growing democratic socialist, harder left. The inchoate expressions that we see in politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Zoran Mamdani, but that will in future iterations be less beholden to loyalty to the Democratic Party establishment, and at some point I suspect will become part of a new party in a way that will be recognizable to American history enthusiasts with the Democratic Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson that opposed the Hamiltonian Federalist Party. The Federalist Party eventually went defunct, and the Democratic Republican Party split into the Democratic Party and the Republican Party that we still have, at least titularly, today. But in this specific case of the New York City mayoral election, the blame cannot be laid at the feet of Curtis Sliwa as being a spoiler candidate, because Mamdani did win an outright majority of the vote. And so even if every single person who voted for Sliwa ended up voting for Cuomo, and of course that wouldn't be the case, Cuomo would garner a majority of Sliwa's support, but not all of it. And so had Sliwa dropped out earlier and endorsed Cuomo, it is highly unlikely to have changed the outcome, which was a Mamdani victory either way. As we continue to fill in the archetypal Mamdani voter, we'll look at religious affiliation among Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. For purposes here, an electoral coalition that we can refer to as Judeo-Christian in a way that is actually descriptive rather than being a propagandistic phrase used for the purposes of retconning and revisionism. That Judeo-Christian coalition broke decisively for Cuomo. Among Protestants, it was the narrowest, with Cuomo winning 47% to Mamdani's 44%. Among Catholics, Cuomo got 53 to Mamdani's 33, and among Jews, Cuomo won 65% to Mamdani's 31%. So again, Protestants, it was a 3-point margin in favor of Cuomo. Among Catholics, a 20-point margin in favor of Cuomo, and among Jews, a 34% margin in favor of Cuomo. And as far as Cuomo served as a proxy for concern about Israel and Zionism, the Christian evangelicals, who would fall under that Protestant, and in the exit poll, it's actually Protestant/other Christian, so that is where the evangelical support would reside. There, Cuomo won by just 3 points, but among Jews, the group that tends to care about Israel the most, it wasn't close at all, with Cuomo beating Mamdani by a more than 2-to-1 margin. And this gets at something that sticks in my craw pretty regularly among one of the journalists that I respect most, and that is Glenn Greenwald, who regularly insinuates that there isn't really much of a relationship between Jewishness and support for Israel, pointing out that the most Orthodox Jews take issue with the Zionist cause, and he asserts that many of the leaders in the West leading the charge against the putative genocide taking place in Palestine, in Gaza, led by the Israeli regime against the Palestinians, that opposition is led by Jews. And of course, there are some Orthodox Jews who are opposed to Zionism, and there are some people of Jewish ancestry, Jewish extraction, who are vociferously protesting what Israel is doing to the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, just as there are those proverbial rooftop Korean types who support Sliwa in this election that Sliwa just got trounced in. But numbers are of the essence when you are trying to understand political trends, and the reality is that the strongest support for American backing of Israel in the Middle East comes from American Jews, and that is represented here in the strong Jewish support that Cuomo garnered. In contrast to Cuomo's solid win among the Judeo-Christian element of the electorate, among those of other religious affiliations or no religious affiliation at all, Mamdani won by a staggering more than 3-to-1 margin. Among those of other religious affiliations, he won 72% to 24% for Cuomo, and among those with no religious affiliation, so atheists and agnostics, Mamdani won 75% of the vote compared to Cuomo's just 20%. Get rid of God and people will worship the state. That might be a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. with this self-described democratic socialist winning 75% of the atheist and agnostic vote. So that purple hair booster of Mamdani's doesn't just have daddy issues, she also has issues with the idea of a daddy in the sky. The daddy is right down here, he's in Albany or he's in Washington, D.C., and he's going to forgive our student loan debts, damn it. Eat the rich already. One category I want to circle back to that I missed previously that comes as little surprise given the pattern by income, and that is among those who either own or rent the place that they live in. Among those who own their domiciles, Cuomo beat Mamdani 55% to 36%, but among those who rent, Mamdani won 59% to 35%, so there's a pretty sizable gap in how those who own their own places voted compared to the renter class. People who don't own any property are going to tend to have more affinity for the idea that no one should own any property so that I can have some of that property that you own since I don't own any. Just as New York City is a vanguard for low fertility, it is also a leader in the non-heteronormative department, to employ some pretentious academic language. Among the alphabet people, those who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or something else, and that constitutes 15% of those who participated in this exit poll, 15% of those who voted in the mayoral election. That is 1 in almost 6 voters are some variation of LGBT, etc. And they went overwhelmingly for Mamdani. Mamdani garnered 82% of the LGBT vote compared to Cuomo's just 15%. In contrast, among the 85% of the population that is heterosexual, it was nearly a tie, with Mamdani getting 47% to Cuomo's 45%. And so as we fill out that Mamdani archetypal voter, we get someone without respect for creation who also has no interest in procreation, but does have an interest in creating and then recreating again their own perceived sexual and gender identity. And so that purple hair who might not hold a lot of sexual appeal for the average red-blooded flyover American is an avowed pansexual herself. To reclinate back to where we started, the exit poll asked a question about how long voters have lived in New York City. For those in the Big Apple, 5 years or less, Mamdani won 86% to Cuomo's 13%. Among those living in one of the boroughs for the last 5 to 10 years, Mamdani won 79%. Cuomo just got 18%. Among those living in New York City for more than 10 years, Mamdani won 55% to Cuomo's 41%. For those, among all, those are all transplants, all people who were not born in New York City, but who moved to New York City at some point in their lives. The longer they had been resident in New York City, the less strong the appeal for Mamdani relative to Cuomo was. But in all cases, for anyone who wasn't born in New York City, they overwhelmingly went for Mamdani. Even in the case of those who had been in New York City for 10 years or more, Mamdani won 55 to 41%, so he won by 14 points. The only residency category that Cuomo won in was among those born in New York City. Cuomo won that group 48% to Mamdani's 39%. So though Mamdani beat Cuomo by double digits in the case of recent transplants by massive margins, Cuomo won comfortably among those who have spent their entire lives in New York City. And so when we say the great replacement really is coming for Cuomo, it's not just at the level of the entire country, even though, of course, there is a lot of overlap, and many of those who have lived in New York City for less than 5 years will have also lived in the United States for less than 5 years. But the demographic transformation that the United States is undergoing currently is not something that is just relevant to the Midwest or old factory towns in rural Maine. It is every bit as acute in the largest population centers in the country, and often is even more pronounced there than it is in a lot of the other less glamorous places that get more attention for putatively complaining about said demographic transformation. It is happening everywhere, and it is affecting everything. I've made mention a couple times of the term democratic socialist. That is something that people outside of big urban areas in the United States might be unfamiliar with, because or if they are familiar with it, they'll view it as a fringe political movement. But in New York City, in the mayoral election that just occurred, 25% of the electorate, that's in a city of 8 million, over 8 million people, 25%, 1 in 4, self-describe as democratic socialists among those who voted. And Mamdani, not surprisingly, overwhelmingly won that category of people with 87% of the vote, compared to Cuomo's just 11%. Among those who do not self-describe as democratic socialists, Cuomo won handily with 53% of the vote, compared to Mamdani's 37%. So without democratic socialism, there would be no Mamdani taking the mayorship. These exit poll results give us a taste of what is likely to come next year in the midterm elections. We have mentioned how well the polls performed last week, and those same polling outfits are predicting a Democratic victory next year. From the Economist YouGov poll this last week, asking about generic congressional votes, quote, if the elections for U.S. Congress were being held today, who would you vote for in the district where you live, unquote. Democrats have a 3-point advantage over Republicans. Very roughly, that suggests that the 6-seat majority that Republicans currently enjoy in the House is likely to flip to something like a 15 to 20 seat Democratic majority next year. Speaking of political gains and losses, there is a lot of high-profile internecine fighting going on among those on the right in America, broadly defined. There is the ascendant populist America First wing of the American right, with a Buchananite and Ron Paulian pedigree, now most popularly represented in figures like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes. And there is the much more moneyed, more established, but fewer in number strain of conservatism, Inc., in corporate conservatism, in allegiance to Israel and Israel first foreign policy. And those tensions have really come to a head in the wake of the Charlie Kirk killing. This is something Jeff and I plan on discussing in the future in greater detail. For now, I want to lay out a broader picture of what I see happening here, and that is the AFDification of the American right. And increasingly, I think the Republican Party, I think that will correspond to a shrinking in its electoral impact. It will become a purer, more distilled representation of what the grassroots America First voter wants, but that the institutional power structure does not want and will not tolerate. When I say AFDification, that is, it's humorous in that it is a reference to the alternative for Deutschland, which is the Germany First party in Germany, that has all the same types of institutional, managerial elites up in arms about, screeching hysterically about trying to destroy and pledging to have all other parties unite against. The fact that it is AF for the German terms for alternative for, and that it just happens to port nicely for America First here in America, in the United States, is a happy, convenient little coincidence. German politics, like other European political systems are different than the United States, and that there are several parties that coalition together, but such that being the party that enjoys a plurality of support, as the AfD now does in Germany, doesn't translate to any sort of ruling authority, because even though the AfD has around 25% of the vote, with all the other parties coalitioning against it, effectively in a Republican versus Democrat two-party system in the United States, porting AfD onto that, it would be as if Republicans controlled 25% of the House, and this coalition of parties acting together, even though they have sometimes divergent interests in the same way that corporate Democrats and democratic socialists have in the Democratic Party, that coalition in opposition to America First, the AFDification of the Republican Party in the United States, that being 25% compared to Democrats having 75%. I think that is the direction that we will be moving into. And in the case of Germany, Germany is 90% white. The United States is 60% white and falling. And so the AfD trajectory, one that leads to distinct minority status in the German political system, will likely find even less purchase on the overall American electorate, given that almost half of that electorate is non-white. And so just as the AfD does not appeal to Turkish and African refugees, settlers, immigrants in Germany, so the America First of Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes is not going to find much appeal among non-whites in the United States. I say this as someone whose sympathies lie much more with the America First AfD side of these questions, with a visceral, inherent revulsion at the conservative Inc. Republican establishment, but whose life's political journey has largely been characterized by realizing that politics is really about power and not much other than power, and that never winning for the sake of being pure is less and less satisfactory as an outcome. I went through a libertarian phase, and that probably is the best manifestation, the Misesian libertarianism of taxation as theft and anarcho-capitalism as an aspirational North Star, a worldview shared by not 1 in 100 of my fellow citizens. In 2024, Trump won by bringing together a coalition of populist America First grassroots support and melded that with an elite insurgency of venture capitalists and Wall Street money men and hedge fund managing Zionists. And there is a lot of overlap with Zionism among those disaffected elite insurgency members. And the tacit agreement seemed to be that we would get MAGA at home and MIGA abroad. That was the compromise that this elite insurgency was willing to make with the populist grassroots support that had propelled Trump to victory in 2016, but permitted him to do nothing with that victory. 2024, he had a lot more money and institutional elite backing behind him, such that in 2024 he was able to hit the ground running, in stark contrast to the floundering that he experienced immediately upon assuming office in 2016, and that would characterize all 4 of the years of his first term. As to why this America First at home and Israel First abroad coalition didn't work, and it looks like it's really coming apart now, I think the lack of explicit articulation of just such a coalition is one big part of the reason that things have come undone. Rhetorically, Trump sounded a lot like the Trump in 2024 sounded a lot like the Trump in 2016, but coming in, the goals, to the extent that Trump had any in 2016, the goals that he had in 2024 very much included the MAGA part of that MAGA coalition, but he didn't make that clear to populist MAGA leaders and pundits. And maybe that's because they would have rejected supporting Trump at all outright. Had Tucker been told that re-electing Trump would mean a reduction of America's global footprint militarily, but that overall reduction would be used to augment America's support for Israel, and that we would move away from Ukraine, and move away from China, move away from antagonism towards Russia, but only so that we could double down our efforts to do Israel's bidding in the Middle East. Somebody like Tucker Carlson have been able to support that in the way that he did. I think it would have been difficult to imagine him so doing. Maybe if it was explicitly stated that way, he could have communicated that that was part of the deal and that the populist America First energy among the grassroots would have to be conditioned to expect they weren't going to get everything that they wanted, but they were going to get a lot of what they wanted on the home front. And how that ends up manifesting itself electorally, because you will lose some number of people who ended up voting for Trump, and this counterfactual would not have on principle, viewing it as a sellout or the same old dog running Trump again, just like they had run Biden during his administration. And in a world where information increasingly is less and less gate-kept, particularly on the populist right, the idea that the America First wing of the Republican Party could just be left in the dark about this MAGA compromise, the idea that once the implicit and assumed compromise partnership came to light, that they would be on board with it, represents a fatal misreading of the pulse of the population that, and this is a sizable population that listens to Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes. But I don't think the blame, such as it is, can be entirely placed at the MAGA elite insurgency side of this doomed partnership. After all, what Donald Trump has done in the first 9 months of his second administration with regards to immigration enforcement is by far the most consequential immigration enforcement executive effort since Dwight Eisenhower's Operation Wetback 70 years ago. And the Trump administration has expended a lot of political capital having ICE agents go in high-profile, hostile situations and take slings and arrows, both figuratively and literally, in the process. And as Kevin Deanna at American Renaissance has pointed out, the Trump administration has not really received a lot of credit from opinion molders and pundits on the right. And it's not just the Ben Shapiros and the Mark Levins who have been scant with their praise. In fact, the MAGA side of things has probably been more vocal about giving the Trump administration credit for those immigration enforcement actions, while those on the America First side of things, present company included, have tended to look skeptically and cynically at this effort as not being enough, being too theatrical, being too much, too little, too late, and otherwise tending to poo-poo these efforts that, on a political scale, on a contemporary American political scale, even if they are not Operation Wetback levels of mass deportations, are still representative of a Herculean effort for an administration trying to enact something that faces such strong and united institutional opposition from academia to a Chamber of Commerce to most of the congressional leadership to social workers and government bureaucrats and refugee organizations, mainline churches, the Vatican, on and on. And that MAGA side of things happened first. And so from a MAGA perspective, it is not entirely unreasonable to look at this situation as one in which we had this implicit agreement that we would give you MAGA at home and MAGA abroad, and we gave you MAGA at home first, and then when we tried to go MAGA abroad, you turned on us. And so you didn't uphold your side of the bargain. And so now we're going to purge you. But there's a problem with trying to purge what represents an outright majority and an increasing majority of your support, because this America First, MAGA yes, MAGA no strain of the Republican Party is most pronounced among younger conservatives. And so this is not a tendency that is going to go away. And even though the MAGA elite insurgency side of things has all the money, that's where all the institutional support is coming from, monetarily, is coming from that donor class. The votes just aren't there. And if people don't get in line, then the successors politically to Trumpism are not going to win if they all sound like Dinesh D'Souza or Lindsey Graham or Mitch McConnell. They're going to have to sound like Tucker Carlson or Marjorie Taylor Greene. If they sound like Carlson or MTG, though, the big donors, the $2 million plus donors that Charlie Kirk was so exercised about leading up to his death, that the donors like Miriam Adelson, who bankrolled Trump's second campaign to the tune of 9 figures, hundreds of millions of dollars, if they go away, there will be the votes there for Republicans, for America First, MAGA Republicans, but there will be even less institutional support and monetary financial support than there is now. And that is what I'm getting at when I look at the Republican Party being set on a track to transition into something like the AFD that does have a strong through line from what the grassroots electorate wants and what the official party pushes for, but that in that process, through that purification process, loses a lot of the support that manifests now in the MAGA side of things and the moderate Republican professional types who think that the left has gone a little bit cuckoo but are not at all in for the hard edge of a Nick Fuentes. As those people fall away and coalesce into a coalition in opposition to that AFDification of the Republican Party, I suspect the political prospects of the GOP are dour indeed. I think we can really see what I've been describing here by looking at a couple of congressional Republicans who are viewed as being on opposite ends of the Civil War on the right. That is Thomas Massie and Randy Fine. Thomas Massie is the most strident congressional opponent, not just among Republicans, but probably just about among all 435 members of the House, in opposition to the MAGA side of that MAGA coalition, such that he has drawn a lot of direct fire from Donald Trump, who is, with his MAGA backers, funding someone to challenge Massie in the primary next year to try to have Massie removed. while Randy Fine, congressman from Florida, who has a sort of disgusting visage and also a correspondingly disgusting tendency to use really vicious language, mocking and celebrating the what I would term ethnic cleansing, but that others have called genocide that is taking place in Gaza and the West Bank, and he has a way of honing in on the most vulnerable members of Palestinian society, in particular mocking and even jeering, celebrating almost the death of Palestinian children at the hands of the IDF and the Israeli state. And so, in other words, the polar opposite of Thomas Massie, Randy Fine is the ultimate champion of the MAGA side of that MAGA coalition. But though it clearly doesn't animate him to the same degree, Randy Fine has done a lot more to support the MAGA side of that MAGA agreement than Thomas Massie has. If we look at Numbers USA's immigration scorecard, Numbers USA is a venerable organization that has been around for decades and very meticulously tracks the legislative voting history of members of Congress and gives them grades based on how immigration restrictionist they are. That the Numbers USA organization is a single issue organization. That is what they look at. They look at immigration and nothing else. And immigration enforcement as a single issue is probably the best proxy for the MAGA side of that MAGA coalition in terms of what the America First contingent expects the Trump administration to do. And for the current Congress, Thomas Massie gets a C-, a 41% voting record on immigration legislation. Randy Fine, in contrast, gets an A+, 100%. From Numbers USA's perspective, Randy Fine literally could not have voted any more immigration restrictionist than he has every opportunity that he's had to do so. And so if you are someone whose political philosophy can be distilled down to a desire for the United States to stop invading the world, stop inviting the world, and stop becoming indebted to the world, I'm not really sure what you're supposed to do with that. There aren't a lot of good options. And on that cheery note, we'll bring things to a close this week. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.